would Putin have had the guts to admit publicly that he blew it, made a mistake, and pulled back, which is what Khrushchev did? That was the remarkable thing about this communist leader. He had the guts, when pressed up against it, to do something that was remarkable. He wasn't sure quite how, but he said, I'm going to put a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants, and he's not going to like it. Just imagine how close we were to what could have been a nuclear war.
He created the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, he moved nuclear-tipped missiles onto Cuba, 90 miles from America's shore, and 50,000 Russian troops, a large number of Russian troops. He shipped them all the way from the Black Sea to Cuba, thinking that he could do it in secret.
He thought he could do it in secret. And the remarkable thing, Warren, is that for 5 months of that episode, that crisis, he got away with it. I was able to talk to them. I spoke Russian and able to talk to them and to get their sense of what it is that was going on. What was Pravda was saying one thing, but what was really happening? Because when it came right down to it in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Russian people felt there was no reason in the world why they should fight for Cuba. It was far away, was an island. It had nothing to do with, quote, us. But when it came to Berlin, when it came to the division of Berlin and the division of Germany, yes, they would fight.
Was Khrushchev surprised by the way that Kennedy reacted?
Yes, he was indeed very surprised. Khrushchev was living in an illusion. He had two big illusions. One of them was that if he could sit down with John Kennedy, just the two of them, alone, they would be able to settle all the problems in the world. Naive, foolish, but that was his dream. The second thing was that he could somehow take Kennedy to the cleaners. And this goes back to the summit meeting that they had in Vienna in June of 1961. The two of them met there for a weekend. And at the very beginning, there was the highest expectation. Great things were going to happen. I learned on Saturday night from a couple of Russians that they gave me a thumbs down. They said it was not going well at all. Kennedy kept on raising with Khrushchev the possibility of miscalculation. He used that word. And Khrushchev was offended by that because Khrushchev felt if there was to be a miscalculation, it would be Kennedy who would be miscalculating, not Khrushchev. And so he screamed, which he was capable of doing a lot. He screamed and he said, miscalculation, miscalculation, bury that word. I'm fed up with that word. I don't want to hear it again. If you keep on saying that, it means that you want war. If you want war, you're going to get it. Oh boy. And Kennedy at that moment wisely said nothing. There was in our business dead air for about 40 seconds. And then the president said, in which case it's going to be a cold winter. And he then built up the American force in West Berlin, built up the American military budget. In late August, 2 months after the summit, Khrushchev decided to build a wall right through Berlin, the Berlin Wall, which went up on August 13, 61, didn't come down until 1989. And during that period, there was a question. What would have happened if Kennedy did not accept the building of the wall? Supposing when the wall went up, Kennedy knocked it down. And Dan Shore, who was a great journalist who was then in Berlin, went into East Germany and interviewed a lot of East German communist officials. And they were saying to him, if you had knocked down the wall, Khrushchev would not have done anything. He couldn't. He was too weak. Dan pointed that out to me, and I went looking at the Moscow end of things to find out what the Russians were saying about that. They were saying the same thing. In other words, we'll never know now, but it is possible, based on what we were picking up there at that time, that if Kennedy had knocked down the wall, Khrushchev would have screamed and done whether or not, but he would have done nothing militarily. The wall would never have stood for that period of time. He took it into his head he would take Kennedy, and in May of '62, he got involved during a meeting in Bulgaria, walking on the beach with Rajan Malinovsky, who was his defense minister. And Malinovsky said to him, "Sir, right across the Black Sea in Turkey, there are Jupiter missiles, American missiles, pointing right at us." Khrushchev got angry, as he did, and screamed, "I'm going to get him." He wasn't sure quite how, but he said, "I'm going to put a hedgehog down Uncle Sam's pants, and he's not going to like it." And what he did at that time was what you were saying before, Warren. They started this massive movement of men and missiles into Cuba. Kennedy didn't learn about it until late August. And when he did, he chose to believe that they were defensive missiles. Now, I don't know how you get away with that, but he was a very popular president, and I suppose you could say these things and people believed it. But missiles, after all, are not friendly instruments. But he thought about them at this time defensive. And it was only when the planes kept bringing back day after day pictures of these missiles pointing at the United States. Some of them, we later learned, had a nuclear warhead at the top of them. And it was only then that Kennedy did that remarkable speech on a Monday night at 7 o'clock on the quarantine of Cuba, launching that critical week that ended on October 28th, a Sunday, when Khrushchev backed away from the confrontation with Kennedy and admitted publicly in a letter to Kennedy that was read on the air. And that, Warren, you get a great kick out of this story. Khrushchev did not read the letter on air, but he had one of the chief broadcasters, a guy named Yuri Levitan, read the letter on air. And I found out earlier that it was a terribly important letter, but I didn't know whether it would be war or peace. Who did? I set it up with CBS to have one line carrying the speech and the other line me giving an English translation of what it is that Khrushchev was saying in his letter. And at a certain point, I heard key verbs like crate and return missiles. And I screamed at the top of my lungs. He just caved. He just caved. The crisis effectively is past. It was an unbelievable story, exciting as can be. And just imagine how close we were to what could have been a nuclear war.